Okay, I wanted to kind of, this is slightly disjointed, but I want to start off by kind of just sort of reminding ourselves of some of the sort of, the basics of what we think about racism, and a few questions that I think can be raised off the back of those basics. I then want to kind of look in some detail at certain issues about changing patterns of racism at the moment, and some of the implications that might have for what we do and say on the left about this. And then I just wanted to end with some fairly unstructured and random thoughts about UKIP in a kind of desperate attempt to turn this theory into and push it in some sort of practical direction. But this is all very much questions and issues to discuss, rather than I have a great theory which I'm going to beam into your heads. So, okay, I just wanted to start with some basics, and there's a very kind of clear pattern in which racism as an ideology presents itself in a very mystified fashion. So the way that we're taught to think about racism is in many ways the opposite of how racism actually is and actually works. So if you kind of chat to people casually, you'll very commonly come across the idea that racism is a fixed and immutable part of human nature, that, ever since we were like tribes back in the olden days, we didn't like the tribe next door, and this is somehow hardwired into our DNA, and that's essentially what racism is, which kind of sets up the whole thing to fail, because we're thus cast into this tragic battle between our better natures and our human nature, and this is a series of cliches comes out of this position, but it's a very, very common argument that you hear. Another very common sort of common sense assumption is that racism has got something to do with skin colour or biology. So sometimes, I remember once hearing someone say that they were really shocked at the kind of racism that David Blunkett was coming out with when he was Home Secretary, because being blind, how could he possibly not? He wouldn't be able to see the difference. This was a naive argument and problematic on a number of levels, but it kind of uses an example of how racism is kind of tied in people's heads to skin colour, and consequently that opens up a space for you to do a kind of I'm not racist but trick by pitching racist arguments as not down to biology. So, for instance, Islamophobia claims it's about, if you argue with a Richard Dawkins fan, they'll say Islam is not race, and proceed to come up with every poisonous stereotype that they would have said about Asians, but hitch it onto Muslims instead, and then somehow this is some sort of get out of jail free card. The other kind of very common common sense assumption, is that racism is fundamentally driven by psychology and individual attitudes. It's an individual prejudice. So you've got these bad people called racists, and if you shame them enough or tell them to give up their bad ways, they'll stop being bad and stop being racist, and racism will magically disappear. These are very common ideas. Of course, as Marxists, we would dispute every single one of those. Racism is not fixed and immutable. It's historically very variable. It's historically very new. You've had random prejudices that go back centuries, but the way they get kind of marshalled into a very kind of systematic structure of prejudice called racism, you can really, even if you go back as recently as Shakespeare's Othello, you see a very different pattern of prejudice. It's only in the past 200 years or so that racism proper really starts to emerge. If you look at the case of what we now call anti-Semitism, now that's anti-Jewish racism, and that was really invented. The word was invented in the late 1800s. A whole series of previous anti-Jewish prejudices was sort of repackaged post the integration of Jews into German society and European society. and rebadged as this kind of scientific, pseudo-scientific thing called anti-Semitism. So you know, that's the first thing I want to underline, that racism is historically very variable. Far from always having been linked to skin colour and biology, that's actually a very recent notion. It's really post-war, in an attempt to disengage Western and ideologies from Nazi ideology, and from racist ideology, as you would see in South Africa or Rhodesia, that the notion that racism is really fundamentally about skin biology has been hammered home. If you read racist texts, or the people who came up with racism from the 1700s and 1800s, the word race is something that's quite explicitly straddles biology and culture. You know, the whole notion of race is something that muddles the two together, and certainly kind of cultural aspects of race were part of the kind of the racist sort of mindset. So the idea that racism has always been biological, and so that the kind of cultural styles of racism around Islamophobia, what have you, represents a kind of innovation, I don't think is quite correct. I think what's happened is that because the biological side of racism has become discredited, the cultural side, which is always there, has come to prominence. That's the way I see that. And of course, the final thing, of course, is that we're far from being rooted in psychological individual attitudes. The psychological individual attitudes are a product of the society we live in, and the kind of the structural and material racism in the way that society is organised. Now, I say that just to kind of as a sort of recap of some ideas that I'm sure that are very familiar on the socialist left. But I want to raise a question coming out of that, which is that if racism is historically variable, how is it changing right now? How is it changing right this minute? Now, is that even something that we can tell? Hegel famously said the hour of Minerva flies at dusk, and there's this, again, a certain kind of tragic outlook that argues that, you know, you can only ever see these things with retrospect. I think there's an element of truth to that, but my sense is that at the moment there are a whole series of shifts going on in terms of the nature of racism, and you can see symptoms of that in all sorts of areas. So I think it's actually kind of worth taking a risk of trying to work out what is actually changing, what is new, and what's fading into the background like that. I say take a risk because the moment you start focusing on marginal changes, the danger comes in that you can be complacent about good old-fashioned racism, you know, which is still there. There's another danger, which is that people can misrepresent you and say that, you know, they can twist your argument and say you're dismissing certain types of racism and, you know, just picking up some reality for the sake of it. You know, I hope I'm not doing that in what follows, but I am, if you like, I am going to try to focus our attention on little details that I think are shifting, that we need to start thinking about now in order to kind of get the big picture of how we orient ourselves right. So, okay, in terms of the historical picture of racism in this country at least, and obviously if you start extending it worldwide, you get a much more complicated picture. But you know, if you look back at the late 1800s, early 1900s, you get Marx talking about Irish labour in Britain, which is a very classic example. You also see, in terms of the kind of, if you like, the legal infrastructure of racism, things like the Aliens Act and so on, a lot of this was really brought in at the turn of at the beginning of the 20th century, essentially to stop, directed against Eastern European Jews coming into the country. And, you know, it's quite astonishing if you look at the sort of things that are said, for instance, about Muslims nowadays, and you compare them to what was said about Jews 100 years ago, and pretty much identical. They're pretty much identical. You know, Even things like people complaining about where I live in the East End of London, that there's a lot of the signs are bilingual in Bengali and English, and of course 100 years ago they wouldn't have even been bilingual. You simply got English, all the signs of speaking Yiddish. So you have that kind of racism. I want to point out that both Irish and Eastern European Jewish immigrants were both white. They weren't necessarily portrayed as white. If you look at the racist caricatures, the ape caricature, all of those kind of carry over, which again kind of underlines the thing I was telling you earlier about how this isn't really about physical appearance. This is about how something is understood socially rather than how it actually is. But really, post the Second World War, you see a period where I think you can talk about racism stabilising in many ways. You have some big geopolitical shifts, essentially the end of empire, decolonisation, and at the same time you get waves of immigration into Britain, essentially coming from black and brown former colonies, so the Caribbean, Africa, and the Indian subcontinent. And of course, these new migrant communities face racism. They have darker skin than the actual the population that was there already. And so the notion of politically black emerges, and really kind of, as these communities start to find their feet and fight back, the idea that what they have in common is a shared experience of racism, and the term black starts to take on a political significance of meaning anyone who is on the receiving end of this kind of racism. Now, there was, if you like, at the height of the recent anti-racist struggles, the sort of struggles that, in my view, really cemented our position in our society here. This notion of political blackness played a key role. And since then, there's been a kind of fragmentation. Nowadays we never say black; we say black and Asian because people just don't understand that the term black encompasses Asians too. That was the case 20 years ago, but no one really gets that anymore. So even on the radical left, where we prefer using that kind of terminology, we make this concession and we say black and Asian. But part of, I think, what made all of that work was a relative stability to the patterns of immigration, the places people were coming from, and also the general, the numbers going in and out. I mean, one of the things, if you look throughout the sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and through the 90s, the number of black and Asian people coming into this country was more or less equalled out by people leaving, either to go to Australia or what have you. So when I remember in the late 70s, when the National Front was saying things like, "There's 3 million unemployed and 3 million black people, so send them back and we can solve unemployment." When people were saying that this island's just too crowded, you could actually turn around and show the statistics that this isn't a matter of the population growing significantly because of immigration. Now, that argument always had its limits, one of which being the racists weren't actually that bothered about what the real facts were. But, of course, when you're arguing with a racist like that, it's very rarely the racist you're actually trying to shift. It's all the other people who are listening in on it and kind of which of these two male loudmouths is the right one, So things like being able to point to statistics like that, I think, were very useful. That's not the case anymore. Post-2004, there has been net immigration of about 200,000 every year. And that hasn't been balanced out by people leaving. So I think that's a shift that we need to get our head around. That we are now going to have to argue against racism, not on the grounds that there is no problem with there being lots of people, more people here. there are more immigrants here than there used to be. Our argument has to be, if you like, be a lot more principled. That we don't care where people are from. That's not that's how we have to shift it. So you know, in terms of if that's the kind of structure of immigration and racism in the post-war period, where, if you like, most of what the socialist left in Britain thinks about racism was formed, how has that changed in really the past 10 years, and looking back a bit before that, maybe the past 20 years? So I'm talking about, if you like, the neoliberal era. And I think you see two things. Firstly, that kind of traditional anti-black racism is beginning to kind of morph and unravel slightly. I'll give you the example I mentioned earlier. I remember the National Front slogan in the late 70s, and the notion of, you know, send them back. And I was like, you know, in my early teens at that point, in the early 80s, and at that point, you know, the notion that you could send these people back was still prevalent. Now you fast forward to 1997, when Nick Griffin takes control of the BNP, and one of the first things he does is he ditches the compulsory repatriation policy of the BNP. So even the fascist right is having to drop this, because what happened is the battles of the 70s and 80s, I think the cultural battles of the 80s were very important here, that by the end of it, the notion that black and Asian people were here to stay had been won. This, to me, is the real significance of the debate around multiculturalism. The debate about multiculturalism was always a debate between, the debate up top, not the debate on the left. The debate up top was a debate between multiculturalism versus monoculturalism. The idea was, do we persist in the notion that there is this singular white British culture that is the true culture, and everyone else is a guest of some sort, and guests leave eventually? Or do we actually have to change the definition of British to accept a certain kind of plurality? And the latter turned out to be the case, I think. So that was quite an important shift, I think. But around about 2000, you saw a new attack on the notion of multiculturalism. You saw the new Labour government shifting towards an idea of community cohesion, which was subtly different, and a way of I think, of taking the residual notions of anti-racism out of the debate on how you manage different communities. You saw a shift away from crude racism towards black and Asians, towards more kind of subtle cultural forms like Islamophobia. But you also saw, you've also seen a real shift, I think, in popular discourse, in the way that ordinary people talk about these things. To say I'm not racist but has become an in-joke now. Everybody knows whenever someone says that, they're about to say something racist, and not only, that's kind of become quite commonly understood. And certain kinds of arguments that 20 years ago you'd have to argue that was racist, you can't say that, or even argue that racism was a bad thing to begin with, and now things that are said in a coded fashion or with a certain degree of shame attached, which is what the I'm not racist but means. What that means is I'm ashamed of being a racist, and the fact that people feel the need to preface their racist statement with that disclaimer tells you something about how we've actually won something ideologically. So I think that style of racism is kind of waning and beginning to eclipse. And I think one of the little indexes of this was the rather bizarre row over Saeed Awarsi resigning recently over Palestine. People might remember this. And I was kind of, what's going on here exactly? Because of my personal sense of masochism, I read the Daily Telegraph every day. There was quite an interesting argument going out on the Telegraph comment pages about this, because really you've got a row between the kind of the Tory grassroots, the Tory fundamentalists, the sort of people that UKIP is courting at the moment, who are basically racist and don't like Saida Warsi at all because she's Asian and a woman and Muslim, versus the sort of Tory modernisers who were the kind of Camerons and Ian Bills and Peter Oliver, the sort of the wiser ruling class heads in the Conservative Party, who've actually done their sums and noticed that in 10 years' time, Asian immigrants in particular, black and Asian immigrants, will probably be deciding marginal seats. One of the patterns of immigration is that people who come into the country are of working age because they come here to get jobs. And so working age is also childbearing age, so they tend to have more children than the population at large, not because we breed a lot, but because that's the demographic. So 20, 30 years on, you start to see, a significant change in terms of schools and then the workforce. And the wiser Tories have noticed this and realised that if they don't lose their reputation for racism, they're going to be sunk electorally. This is one of the problems that's hit the Republican Party in the US. If you look at the 2008 presidential elections where Obama gets in, one of the significant things is that the Hispanic vote shifts over to the Democrat camp because the Hispanics are pissed off with Bush's anti-immigrant thing that he did in 2006. And if you look at the 2012 elections, not only do the black and Hispanic people stick with Obama, Asian Americans, historically quite right-wing, again, move over into the Democrat camp. So, essentially the kind of racism of the Republicans progressively starts alienating larger and larger numbers of people to the point where it starts to become electorally rocky for them. Now, this is the contradiction on the right that I think I'll come back to because I think the UKIP phenomenon is tied up with this. So if that style of classical racism against black people is, if you like, kind of receding into the background, I'm not saying disappearing because it's always lurking there. What I think is coming to the fore is a racism that's directed against the new economic migrants who are primarily Eastern European, Polish, Romanian, Bulgarian, what have you. One particularly disgusting version of this was on Question Time this week where the BBC used the murder of Alice Gross to kick off a very enlightened debate on what do we do about these Latvians coming over here and murdering people, So I think this kind of anti-immigrant racism, which you start to see the roots of again in the early New Labour period with the anti-asylum seeker stuff. I remember at the time, I wasn't an active socialist back then, but I remember very shortly after Labour got in, you had the Macpherson report, and there was this kind of period of a bit of a honeymoon that if you were sort of a naive reformist like me, you thought, yay, Tony Blair's fixed racism for us. And then you start seeing this anti-asylum seeker stuff, and I'm like, hang on, isn't that racist? Am I the only person who thinks this is racist? Am I going a bit mad here? And I remember seeing socialist worker posters with asylum seekers welcome here, and I remember thinking, well, I very much doubt they are welcome here, but I'm very glad someone's saying that, because it means I'm not going mad and someone else has noticed there's something dodgy about this. But that kind of laid the seed for a much kind of broader anti-immigrant racism that isn't directed against people who are obviously black in the commonsensical way. So, if the term politically black was becoming politically useless because people didn't understand what it meant, I think it's kind of become even more useless now in terms of winning an argument that the anti-immigrant prejudice, which I've kind of been floating the term migrophobia as a kind of, little sexy buzzword for it, because the term anti-immigrant racism is a little bit of a mouthful. But this kind of migrophobia that's directed against Eastern European immigrants, against asylum seekers, against foreigners in general, but it's always pitched around, oh well, it's not race, it's about managing immigration, managing our borders. And that discourse built its way up through the 2000s, or the noughties, as I believe they're called. 2005 general election, Michael Howard's poster of, are you thinking or we're thinking it's not racist to oppose immigration? And since then, also Labour has sold the pass on this. So you're getting this situation where, for the past 5 to 10 years, both the big mainstream parties have been saying it's not racist to be against immigrants or against immigration. They always kind of make it abstract like that. Whereas, of course, if you talk to people on the streets, they don't say, I'm voting UKIP because I think we need to have a firm management of our immigration policy. They say, I'm voting UKIP because the immigrants are the problem, But that has started to become the key factor. And I think one of the things is that we have a difficulty pinning down and winning the argument that the muck that is chucked at these people is actually racism. And I think we need to start thinking about how we can start to win that argument. One of the things I've noticed is that while kind of middle-class liberals who are hung up on dictionary definitions of racism might have a problem understanding that when you say that about the Poles, it's racist. Ordinary people frequently don't, because ordinary people go via the form of a statement, not necessarily the dictionary definition. A very common argument around Muslims, I would hear people say things like, yeah, but if you said that about Jews, it would be racist. If you said that about black people, it would be racist. So if you think about what's going on in people's heads there, what they're noticing is that the abstract structure of the statement is racist. And the fact that this happens to be about black people, happens to be about Jews, happens to be about Muslims, is, if you like, secondary. Now, I think that's the sort of thing Gramsci would call good sense, that there is an understanding out there that racism isn't about the specific target in the here and now, but is about a way of talking about people, and that we are talking in that way about these new immigrants. And I think that might be a kind of, if you like, a foot in the door, if you like, to win an argument about what the nature of racism is. I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that an abstract understanding of racism is actually quite useful here, because you abstract away from historical specifics in the here and now, and you can actually see that even though racism is changing, this new stuff is still racism. Okay, the other. How long have I got left? I'll try and wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. So if we've got this shift of racism towards immigration, I think we need to win the argument that this is racist. We also need to sharpen up a lot about our arguments about immigration. Certain things that we used to say, for instance, that the numbers going out and the numbers going in match each other. That's simply not the case anymore. I do think we need to try and work out how to tie it to class issues, because at the moment, when I look at what the left says about racism, I see kind of 3 broad categories, and none of them quite work. One of them is moral arguments against racism, that racism is a bad thing, you shouldn't be a bad person, so you shouldn't be racist. Now, on one level, this is indisputable, and I'm in favour of moralism as a last resort, but I do think that in a period of economic turmoil like we're having at the moment, it's much, much harder to win these arguments on the basis of appealing to people's good natures. When there's a sort of boom, and people feel confident or optimistic about the future, things can only get better, as the 1997 Labour Party campaign had it, then people are willing to kind of, take a punt on that sort of thing. If they feel under threat, it's a lot harder. I mean, one of the really interesting things about this book, Revolt on the Right, the Ford Goodwin book on UKIP, is they do a lot of sociological research into who exactly is being pulled by the UKIP vote. Now, they say it is the white working class, which I think is a defect of their categorisation. I wouldn't call the people that they pinpoint as UKIP voters the white working class, but it is a layer of people who've been, if you like, left behind by changes in society. Now, when those changes in society seem to be kind of going in a positive direction, those kind of people could either shut up or be kept in a box. Now that things are looking bleak, and not just bleak in the short term, bleak looking forwards, nobody thinks we're going to get back to the sort of social democratic settlement that was taken apart in the 70s and 80s. This is one of the reasons why the Ken Loach spirit of 45 sort of nostalgia hit a chord. But I do think that sort of thing is nostalgia, actually should undermine. So those moral arguments, I think, hit a certain limit of their efficacy. There are also neoliberal economic arguments against anti-immigrant prejudice. Someone like Jonathan Portes, who was a key civil servant under Blair during the 2004 accession, when lots of Polish people were coming in an economic boom period. Now, he's pissed off at the way that all of a sudden he's been blamed for everything, and has come out fighting, and has been very, very sharp in terms of ripping through the pseudo-statistical arguments that the anti-immigrant middle class have been pushing forwards in the opinion columns and what have you. People like David Goodhart from Demos have been pushing quite a sophisticated and basically racist argument against immigrants. And the key people who've been arguing against it have been the Blairites from 2004. Now, they have a lot of good arguments, and it's worth reading their stuff, but of course everything is ultimately pitched in immigration is good for the economy. And in a period when people aren't really feeling that the economy is good for them, I don't think that argument is going to fly. So they've got another set of arguments that don't quite work. The third set of arguments, I think, is a workerist arguments that just duck the issue of race altogether. They say things like, don't vote UKIP because the guy's a Tory and he wants to slash public spending or what have you. No, those are good arguments against UKIP in and of themselves, but they don't, they represent a way of not dealing with the race issue and hoping the class arguments will somehow just trump them, and whoever you're arguing with will just forget about the race stuff and follow you on the class lines. And I don't think that works. I think the whole argument we had about jobs for British workers was an example of that, because the Socialist Party's approach to that was, well, let's just shut up about racism and talk about the economic reasons why we shouldn't use that slogan, and we use this slogan instead, as opposed to explicitly saying there is a problem with that slogan. So I do think we do need to argue against racism, and do that in a way that actually appeals to class consciousness and appeals to people's economic motives of the economic self-interest of the working class. Now, how you do this, I'm not so sure, but the notion that every time we accede to anti-immigrant racism, we are hitting ourselves in the pocket, that this is going to damage our class. We have to start winning that. Now, one positive example, came from the NHS demo the 999 NHS things that's been touring the country and ended up in London about last month. I was in Trafalgar Square along with Sophie, who's a medical student in RS21, and she was doing the Docs Not Cops initiative, which was basically going around this demo saying the changes the Tories have brought in are forcing doctors and medical workers to essentially be immigration cops, and we think this is a bad thing. And people were like, yes, I'm signing that. And I thought that was quite interesting, partly because that demo had brought a working class social democratic audience to support the NHS, but having heard for the 20th speech about how great the NHS is and how if you vote Labour the NHS is going to get saved, people were kind of getting a bit tired and were looking for something slightly more radical, something with a bit more of an edge in it. And so this docs not cops thing really kind of caught them. And I think that's an argument that you can use, that, you know, when you get older, you are probably going to be cared for by someone, you know, we're going to need immigrant labour to care for people, you know, things like that, that it is in our interests as the working class to accept immigrants, to fight for them, to see them as part of our side. And issues like the NHS, I think we can leverage to a certain extent. I just want to end very briefly with talking about UKIP, because I think we're seeing here a case study of how a far-right party that's run by someone who's very clever. Farage is very sharp. I think he's the most, you know, I did initially kind of sort of bought the image that he presents himself on the telly as being this sort of slightly posh idiot. But if you actually read this book about how he's positioned himself and how he positioned UKIP and how what you're seeing now in terms of the UKIP kind of bursting through the 10% mark and starting to become a serious threat to the mainstream parties was actually part of a game plan that he put in place in 2009, 2010, kind of sensing that the BNP were not going to be able to capitalise on a right-wing shift in sentiment in society. You know, the guy is a very clever operator, and he has pitched UKIP's racism at precisely this point that's not seen as racism. So, for instance, when one of his activists says something racist about that Thai woman who was a UKIP activist, not only does Farage instantly apologise, he apologises in person and brings camera crews along with him. And, you know, sure enough, that woman is now back being an activist for UKIP. So he's very, very careful about pitching everything in terms of anti-immigrant migrophobia rather than classical racism, and trying to kind of keep a file. And of course it's completely disingenuous, because the people the thing he's stirring up, the passions he's stirring up, don't make those fine distinctions. But I do think you're seeing that because of the crisis on the right, which I mentioned earlier, that neoliberalism immiserates the bulk, not just the working class, but the majority of the middle class, the petty bourgeoisie, which is the basis of the Tory party's vote. So right-wing parties start facing a problem, because inequality means that their own base starts to become disgruntled. So they shoot off to the far right, and you're seeing this big time in France at the moment, which is very, very worrying. We might well get Marine Le Pen as the next president of France, and goodness knows what we're going to make of that. So I think with UKIP you're seeing a precise, a symptom, a crystallisation of some of the shifts in racism that we're talking about. And the question of how we update our theoretical understanding of racism to account for these changes, and what works in terms of actually attacking and tearing lumps out of UKIP, and works in terms of pushing them back. I think those two questions are very, very related. So theory and practice kind of go hand in hand. In terms of what we on the revolutionary left can do, we're kind of thinking in the long term, thinking about issues on the horizon that maybe aren't winnable in the here and now, but I think we have to start creating a mass left pole for this kind of explicitly abstract understanding of racism that understands anti-immigrant racism is racism, and understands that it is in the interests of the class that oppose this resolutely, and tries to win an audience for that in the working class, initially amongst the most class-conscious elements, but then pulling in wider and wider numbers. Now, I think we are going to be a small minority on that to begin with, and that's going to be a long-term project, something that will have to last at least 5 to 10 years before we start to see the visible results. But I think it's something we have to start doing now.